I found it interesting in doing the research that we're not necessarily, by what we have at this juncture in terms of information, looking at a complete shift necessarily, but we're looking to see the areas that are wet get wetter and the areas that are dry get drier. And that for me was an interesting learning that came out of the research that I did in putting this together. When we talk about drought, and I guess to a certain extent the question with regard to heat emergencies typically is tied to drought conditions, and we've seen that in the past. I think it is a question of having the critical infrastructure owners start to rethink the plans that they currently have in place. Where we see more frequent events, higher volume of storage for standby generators and things that they may require as a result of these events occurring, or in the area where we have an impact on our ability to deliver service, start moving through, if you go down to California, you'll see on a regular basis they go through rotating blackouts during the hot times. If we move into a period where that becomes an issue for us, then clearly we're going to have to start rethinking what some of those business continuity plans are, and for instance what some of the public health implications of this will be and how we continue to be able to move that discussion forward. Also, the actual planning for changes in staffing levels for response agencies. If we're going to see these emergencies occur on a much more regular basis, then do we have the resources that are required to be able to deal with this on a regular basis as well? And I think that ties back to most of the other issues. I'll leave this one. That's his summary. So very quickly, some of the vulnerable population impacts. People become isolated, unable to access their homes or get out of their homes quite often during the winter storms, unable to maintain basic requirements, board, food, water. And again, this goes back to my comment this morning with regard to social networks. In places where we have tight social networks, these issues for the most part are being addressed. It's when in the absence of those social networks that we have a problem. Traffic signals, the majority of those are not backed up in power. That means that we need municipalities to start assessing what their risks are associated with outages currently and increased potential for outage, to look at the kinds of mitigation strategies that they can put in place. And it's actually, traffic signals are very, very inexpensive to be able to back up. A lot of municipalities are doing those engineering surveys right now to find out what they can do. It would be virtually impossible, for example, for BC Hydro to put a priority on all the major traffic signals throughout the Lower Mainland and give them any kind of priority over things like hospitals, police stations, fire stations where we have to respond. Communication failures, we talked about that a little bit earlier, and the inability for the public in some cases to be able to access service. This one I really hesitated in terms of putting up, but you know what? In the last major event that we saw, which was the Richard Street manhole fire, the Vancouver police were very clear about the fact that when the lights go out for extended periods of time, they end up having to boost their service requirement and make sure that they're doing policing a little differently than perhaps they would on a day-to-day basis. And this was certainly something that was a challenge for them. Having said that, they said that they were very successful in pulling off a number of cross-Canada warrants during that time period as well. I'm hurrying. Social and economic impacts related to flooding, always the issues of death, injury, displacement, financial loss. Those are in all the literature, that's nothing new. For us, when we start talking about flooding, encroachment on limits of approach, there is a set distance between the ground and where our lines are, whether they're transmission lines or distribution lines. And when we have the flood that raises that level up 3, 4, 8 feet, you're now much closer to the electric lines than we would want you to be. And we're starting to have discussions on how we can mitigate that. Difficulty in recognizing risk to the first responders working in flooded areas. It is not always evident when you have an area that's still energized, when you have police or fire folks wandering around maintaining a cordon, where the risk will be, because as soon as you've added water to the equation, now that puddle effect that we see in terms of the step effect potential is magnified in the water. So that's something that we've been working toward in terms of communicating that type of information. I have a series of outstanding questions. Now, is the next period for question and answers? Is that the
I was
idea?
going to, we're just we're somewhat short on time, so I was going to have a few questions for you, then move to Kelly's presentation, then have a little bit more Q&A, and then do a group discussion.
Okay.
So,
These are some of the questions that we're looking at this point in time in terms of planning required for system upgrades that we have on the books currently don't necessarily address climate change, and that's probably the next shift in terms of our mindset is to look at where we need to go in terms of those. Do we have enough resources to manage frequent and more intense weather events? Do we need to consider amending job descriptions? For me, this is a big thing. We have our responders who are out on the field on a regular basis that are dealing with outages like the one that we're going to deal with now. We have a whole bunch of people in our Emergency Operations Center framework under the incident management system who didn't hire on for this, that came in as operational or as support staff or management staff that have never had an operational background. And if we see them starting to activate 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year as opposed to once or twice, you can imagine that this might be an interesting paradigm for our HR folks. Budget concerns, policy requiring changes in how we deal with, for instance, down power lines. Our last storm, November 12th last year, we had in excess of 1,000 down wire calls. Okay? And those are life safety risks immediately. So the public has to understand we need to either address a combination of the public safety risk and the restoration, or do we focus on the public safety risk first, which means that restoration is going to take longer before we can get there. It's not an easy solution, and it's something that our company is dealing with and looking at this point in time, in conjunction with some of our partners like the Vancouver Regional District Fire Chiefs Group. This one is something that I think is interesting. We've talked in emergency management, particularly at the municipal level, for a long period of time about our poor land use decisions. Okay? And one of the things that struck me is that those poor land use decisions impact organizations and companies like BC Hydro, yet we have no part of that discussion at this point in time. So it seems to me maybe the potential exists as the catalysts come forward that utilities like BC Hydro, Terrace, and Fortis have an opportunity to weigh into this discussion on land use and perhaps move that along, because clearly it's not something, and I think Dora and I discovered when we were doing research on governance for the regional district a couple of years ago, is that there is no requirement in legislation for local authorities to look at mitigation in any way, shape, or form currently in the Provincial Emergency Program Act, right? So preparedness, response, recovery, absolutely. But mitigation is not listed as a responsibility of the local authorities under the Provincial Emergency Program Act. Change in weather patterns, change in sea level, critical service providers understanding the difference between major emergency and disaster. Okay? Horntelli is the major theorist on this that looks at issues related to quantification of the differences in definitions. And when you talk about an emergency, there is an overwhelming predisposition on the operational people to just simply suggest that a disaster is just a big emergency, and it is not. When you talk about emergencies being for us, cars into poles, outages like this one, when you take that and move it to the next category, we're now talking about the fact that we've got transportation impacts, communication impacts, impacts to our own staff, potentially as a result of the event, and a lot of other concerns that make this not the same. They are qualitatively and quantitatively different when you compare an emergency to a disaster. And we don't have that recognition operationally. So the operational folks have a tendency to say, leave me alone, we can deal with this. We deal with this every day, it's the same thing. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about police or fire or hydroelectric utilities, they all are prone to that same mentality of what I call the operational vortex. Just leave me alone, I've got enough resources, we can deal with this. And by the time they make the recognition that things have changed, it's too late. Assets. Yeah.
Can we hand this over to, do you have more? Or?
No, I think
the questions
that's
are
it.
really interesting, so do we not?
I think the last one, for me,
they want to ask.
yeah, I don't know necessarily what all the questions are, and I'm not sure that anybody does, and so that's one of our biggest issues at this point in time, is not knowing what we don't know and what questions that we